Mr. President, in just a moment I want to talk a little bit about the situation in Afghanistan, but before I do that, I just wanted to speak to something that the Majority Leader said earlier regarding some of the upcoming business that we have to deal with this fall. We have a whole series of deadlines in front of us. The fiscal year ends on September 30th, meaning that we have to at some point fund the government, which presumably would be in the form of a continuing resolution, and we're told that the House of Representatives, when they move that and send it over here, will include a debt limit increase. The debt limit does run out. I mean, we will hit that at some point, varying estimates of when exactly that would be. Some say as early as mid-October, some say perhaps mid-November, but inevitably that will be upon us. And there's been a discussion here about how that ought to be lifted and who ought to deliver the votes to get that done. And I just want to make the point, Mr. President, that the Majority Leader, as he was down here making his remarks earlier, indicated that this was all debt that was accumulated during the previous administration. And certainly there was some debt because obviously during the coronavirus pandemic, all of us responded in a very bipartisan way. Most of the debt was at that point in time. It was the votes that we made in March of 2020 and subsequently to that. And of course, there was another $2 trillion earlier this year in February, which no Republican voted for. That was all Democrat votes, most of which had nothing to do with the virus, most of which had to do with other elements of their agenda, including expanding the government. But nevertheless, when the debt limit, hit its expiration at the end of July, it reset, and it covered everything up until that point. What we're talking about now is raising the debt limit to accommodate trillions and trillions of new spending proposed by the Democrats here in Washington and by the President and his administration. And it strikes me at least that being the case, if the Democrats on their own without a single Republican vote, and there won't be any Republican votes for the $3.5 trillion bill that they're talking about, which the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says really isn't $3.5 trillion, it's $5.5 trillion. $5.5 trillion of new spending, massive expansion of the government, financed some with tax increases, but inevitably some with adding to the debt. That it would make sense that since the Democrats are going to do that through reconciliation, which is a purely partisan exercise, with only their votes, that it could accommodate and increase the debt limit to pay for all that spending. I think that's a fair, very fair way to look at this, and it strikes me at least that since the Democrats have embarked upon this one-party rule approach, that they, if they're going to spend another $3.5 to $5.5 trillion, that they ought to raise the debt limit to accommodate all that additional spending. And I think that's a reasonable way to approach this, and I frankly think it's consistent if you look at what's happened in the past. The last time we raised the debt limit was in summer of 2019, but that was a bipartisan deal. And it was a bipartisan deal that actually put caps on spending. We were limiting spending as we were raising the debt limit. And Republicans and Democrats joined together at the time to do that. The spending that I referenced in March of 2020, the $4.5 trillion thereabouts that was spent on the response to the pandemic, was also bipartisan. In fact, so bipartisan it passed in the Senate 96-0. Does anybody here ever remember anything around here passing 96-0, particularly of that consequence? Clearly, strong bipartisan support for doing something that needed to be done in response to the worst pandemic that we've seen in this country in a century. Those were things that were done in a bipartisan fashion. Now, this is an entirely different scenario, and I don't think anybody can dispute the fact that the Democrats, as they embark upon this $3.5 trillion reckless tax and spending spree, and again, other estimates, Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says it's not $3.5 trillion, it's actually $5.5 trillion when you look at the spend out in the various budget windows and timelines. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that it's $3.5 trillion to $5.5 trillion, still a massive amount of spending. none of which is related to the coronavirus, all of which is part of a dramatic expansion of government, which I have referred to before here on the floor as the free everything bill. Literally cradle to grave, the government, the federal government, will take care of you, in addition to a lot of other left-wing agenda priorities, a lot of green energy provisions, all sorts of things in this, Mr. President, that are Democrat priorities with no buy-in from Republicans, no attempt to reach out to Republicans or do anything in a bipartisan way. This is a strictly, purely partisan exercise in which the Democrats are trying to include things that have absolutely no relationship to spending, debt, or revenues, which is what the reconciliation process is designed for. They're talking about doing immigration. Immigration, major policy that needs to be done on a bipartisan basis that affects this country in a profound way, as we can see from the crisis at the border already. In the month of July this year, it was a 420% increase over the previous year in the number of illegal crossings. 212,000 people came across the border illegally just in the month of July, Mr. President. It is a major consequential crisis, and the Democrats are going to try and do something to legalize people who are here illegally without addressing the other elements of the immigration debate on a strictly partisan basis as a part of the reconciliation bill. This is a purely partisan exercise done without any input from Republicans. And I don't think there's a single Republican who ought to be pushed into or feel like they in any way need to support the massive expansion of government we're talking about here, the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of new spending. That's what the debt limit is about. It's about raising the amount of debt, the amount that this country can borrow to pay for a massive expansion, reckless expansion of our government that moves us more in the direction of a Western European social democracy rather than the American country that I think we all know and love. We have a heritage in this country. It's built around freedom. It's built around individual responsibility. It's built on the need to protect our country and maintain a strong national defense. I think that's one thing I hope that as we look at spending we can agree upon. But this massive expansion of what they call social or human infrastructure is nothing more and nothing less than the biggest expansion of government that we've seen literally in decades. And it will be financed, some with tax increases, which I could spend a lot of time talking about, which will harm the economy, but also with additional debt. And that debt, the debt that is acquired for the huge run-up in spending, that will be supported purely by Democrats through reconciliation, a procedure that is a partisan procedure, that ought to be paid for. That ought to be done by Democrat votes. And it can be done. It's perfectly, there's a way in which the reconciliation procedure can be used to raise the debt limit, to pay for all the new spending that the Democrats have in this bill. And so when they get down here and talk about how important it is this be bipartisan, well, it'd be one thing if there was actually any kind of a bipartisan negotiation going on, but there isn't. And the last time the debt limit was raised, there was, in 2019. And at that time, it was about caps. It was about reducing spending. There was a bipartisan agreement to reduce spending as the debt limit was being increased. And the other thing I would mention, Mr. President, in response to what the majority leader said earlier, is that the debt that was accumulated in the previous administration, much of which was done on a bipartisan basis in response to the biggest pandemic that this country has seen in 100 years. In March of 2020, $4.5 trillion of that debt was put on the bill because of a bipartisan agreement that was reached. As I said earlier, 96 to 0. 96 to 0 was the vote here in the United States Senate. So Democrats want to go down this path. They want to spend like there's no tomorrow, and tax like there's no tomorrow, and borrow like there's no tomorrow. Then they ought to pay with their votes when it comes to raising the debt limit and, unfortunately, handing the bill for that to our kids and grandkids. Mr. President, 20 years ago on a clear September morning, the unthinkable happened, an attack on our nation here at home, on our own soil. Almost 3,000 Americans died that day, and our nation reeled. But in the midst of grief and fear, there was also hope. We saw evil on September 11th, but in the days and weeks that followed, we saw good as well. The first responders who raced to the scene and spent the weeks after combing through the rubble. The heroic Americans who fought back against the terrorists on United Flight number 93. The hours-long lines for blood donation as Americans scrambled to do anything that they could to help. And out of the ashes of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, came a new birth of patriotism and resolve. America might be bloodied, but she would not break. Evil and terror would not win. The 9/11 generation of warriors and intelligence personnel took the fight to the terrorists in the Middle East and around the world. Our men and women in uniform dismantled terrorist safe havens, disrupted terrorist groups, thwarted attacks, and hunted down and delivered justice to Osama bin Laden. And in Afghanistan, the downfall of the Taliban at the hands of our soldiers and our NATO allies allowed a generation of Afghans to grow up in freedom. I was honored to get to spend part of September 11th with members of the South Dakota Air National Guard, many of whom served overseas in the fight against terrorism. Mr. President, as we mark the 20th anniversary of September 11th on Saturday, our soldiers and our veterans should have been able to reflect on their successes in the fight against terrorism over the past 2 decades. But I know that today many of them are struggling with the recent events in Afghanistan. The United States' disastrous, hasty withdrawal is a stain on our nation's history and a betrayal of the men and women who fought there. But I hope they know that their sacrifices and the sacrifices of their comrades were not in vain. As I said, their actions enabled a generation of Afghans to grow up free from the oppressive hand of the Taliban and kept the country from being a haven for al-Qaeda and other terrorists. Despite the grim current situation in Afghanistan, I'm convinced that the seeds of freedom sown by our military men and women will yet bear fruit on Afghan soil. Mr. President, I and many others warned that a total troop withdrawal in Afghanistan that ignored conditions on the ground was going to be a strategic disaster, and it has been. The United States has historically maintained a limited military presence in foreign countries when it is in our national security interest to do so. And with a presence of just 2,500 to 3,000 troops, we were maintaining stability for a country that was fighting to find its way toward freedom and democracy and simultaneously protecting the interests of our own country. All of that, of course, is now at an end. President Biden's disastrous decision to completely withdraw U.S. troops on a timeline he announced to our enemies allowed the Taliban to bide their time until our ultimate departure. American citizens are still trapped in Afghanistan, and thousands of Afghans who worked with U.S. troops and U.S. intelligence are in grave danger. And Afghanistan is well on its way to once again becoming a terrorist haven. In fact, the Taliban has already appointed terrorists to top post in its new government. There's also every reason to fear that government oppression will once again become the norm in Afghanistan, particularly for women and girls. Mr. President, we heard over and over again that President Biden was going to restore America's standing in the world and repair our relationships with our allies, particularly our NATO allies. In fact, he's done the opposite. His Afghanistan disaster is a national embarrassment. He failed our troops, he failed the American people, he failed our allies, and he failed the Afghans who risked their lives with and for us. The Parliament of a key U.S. ally, the United Kingdom, condemned President Biden in the strongest terms for his dishonorable withdrawal from Afghanistan. The fact that we have left behind thousands of Afghans who worked with our country and whom we promised to protect is unconscionable. It is a stain on our country's record that will not easily be wiped away. And I really hope, that the President does everything within his power to get Afghans who worked with us and any remaining U.S. citizens out of the country as soon as humanly possible. In the coming weeks, the relevant committees in the House and the Senate need to conduct thorough oversight and investigations to understand why this withdrawal was done in a manner that further empowered and strengthened the Taliban and their al-Qaeda allies. We also need to discover why there was no effective plan to get our citizens and our Afghan allies to safety. The scenes of chaos at Hamid Karzai Airport should never have happened. And we need to find out why they did. 13 brave Americans died protecting our withdrawal. 11 Marines, 1 soldier and 1 sailor. And it's hard not to wonder if their deaths could have been avoided had there been a better plan in place for evacuation. The families of these men and women and the American people deserve answers. And the Biden administration must provide them. Mr. President, the weeks of August 2021 will live in infamy. The President's ill-considered, untimely withdrawal and complete lack of an effective plan to evacuate Americans and our Afghan allies created a humanitarian crisis and the conditions that allowed the Taliban to swiftly take over the country. The President's actions have helped condemn women and girls and the entire Afghan people to once again live under pre-9/11 oppression. And he has emboldened terrorists and increased the security risk facing our nation. It's tragic that all the good we have done in Afghanistan has come to this. Mr. President, I yield the floor.